Hello, my name is Marc De Santis, and today I will be speaking with Lindsay Powell, the celebrated ancient historian and author of 2016 Germanicus, The Magnificent Life and Mysterious Death of Rome's Most Popular General, as well as 2023's Marcus Agrippa, Right-Hand Man of Caesar Augustus, both published by Pen and Sword. Listeners to this podcast and viewers on our YouTube channel will know Lindsay as a long-standing participant in the Ancient Warfare podcast. His latest book, Tiberius, From Masterly Commander to Masterful Emperor of Rome, will be out soon from Pen and Sword and is the subject of this episode. Welcome, Lindsay. How are you?
Well, thank you, Mark, and I feel very chuffed by that introduction. It's very interesting. There are lots of historians, so when you speak in kind terms like that, it makes me warm and fuzzy.
All true. So, Lindsay, why don't you tell me what the political situation of Rome was like at the time that Tiberius was born?
Tumultuous is the word I think that best encapsulates it. When Tiberius was born in November of 42 BC, it was only 2 years after the assassination of Julius Caesar, which then plunged the Roman world into a fierce civil war, ending at the two battles of Philippi in Greece. And in fact, Tiberius's parents are refugees. They're sort of escaping, having switched from the support of Julius Caesar's side to supporting, in this case, the other side. And this, by now, we're talking a serious problem. And they're sort of far away from home, so they're trying to get back to Rome at this point. So that's the background. It's very, very bad. And in fact, you could argue that, that for all people of that generation, their parents' generation, life had been very unsettled anyway, because before the assassination of Julius Caesar, there was a short period of relative peace. But before that, there'd been a civil war. If you remember, Crassus was one of the members of the triumvirate. But it was really the fallout between Pompey the Great and Julius Caesar, which led to a war between those. And then, as I say, immediately after that, with the assassination of Julius Caesar, because of the feeling that he's become too aggrandized, too autocratic, that he is assassinated. So people are having to pick sides, and his parents pick a side.
And how does that work out for him? How does Tiberius end up becoming affiliated with Augustus?
Oh, there's a fascinating story just there. So to try and collapse this into sort of bite-sized chunks, because it's quite a detailed story. In 42 BC, he's just born. And within the short space of a couple of months, maybe, of him being born, a peace is declared between the combatants in this particular case. And now you've got this emerging situation where there are really three people who are supreme in all this. The sort of the three victors, if you like, that come out of the civil war against the conspirators, and that's a young man we call Octavian. Whose correct name by this point is actually going to be Caius Octavius. And then there's his partner in war, which is the famous Marcus Antonius. And the third man, who's Lepidus, Emilius Lepidus. And effectively that they have been the force that went against the conspirators. And they're left to try and pick up the pieces. And in the following years, over the next 10 or so years, Tiberius grows up in a Rome which is adjusting itself to the devastation of families that have been lost in large numbers who supported the side of the conspirators. There's a sense of distrust, I have to imagine, that's going through all of this. And in the meantime, there's this sort of sense of rising power of Octavian, who is the heir. And by now he's actually using the name of Caius Julius Caesar, which he's allowed to because he's actually being given that as his legacy by Julius Caesar, who had adopted him in his final years. The net result of all of this is that really you see power politics between giants, and things start going south. So Tiberius is a young boy who's learning the things that Roman boys are taught, how to read and write clearly, but also Homer and all the sort of great Greek works, and gradually learns oratory, rhetoric, and the art of public speaking. Against all of this, and you have to imagine that sort of being now in the house, being a stepson of Octavian. In the meantime, he marries his mother. which is an interesting kind of complication because, in fact, when he was born, his mum and dad were together, and they were actually fleeing across and ending up in different situations. In fact, in the first year or two of his life, it was basically a race for safety. And his mother's clutching him and taking him all the way down to the toe of Italy, and then they cross, and they eventually find themselves in the security and support of Mark Antony. So against that background, which is to say tumult, you have a young man growing up. The man who's rising powerfully, it turns out, really is the heir of Julius Caesar. Now, he is at this point the stepson, as I say, of Octavian. So he is going to be living in the house, surrounded by people, family, his sister Octavia, for example, and other members of this very extended family. And he's going to be privy to all the sort of things that go on. So he's going to be learning about politics, he's going to be learning about war, and he's just going to learn about the dynamics of Roman society and how that goes together. And it's going to be quite a rich education. By the time you get to about 32 BC, the relationship between Octavian and Mark Antony is broken down, and they go to war. So there's now a new civil war. And the victor of that, first at Actium, and that would be in 31 in September, and then later, a year later, in Alexandria in 30. The victor of that, the last man standing, in fact, is Octavian. And in 27, he arranges a deal with the Senate. He retains command of the armies in most of the provinces. The provinces are divided up between him and the Senate. And a grateful Senate decides to call him the revered one, which is Augustus in Latin. And that's how it happens. So Augustus is not a relative of Augustus through birth, or blood, but really through the relationship that he has as being the stepson of Augustus. And all through his life, Augustus will be a towering figure, a big influence, a big role model for him.
He's too young, clearly, to fight in the civil wars against Mark Antony, but he did have a sterling military career, particularly in Northern Europe, the Balkans. What role did he play for Augustus? He seems like he was Augustus's fireman, if I can use that term.
Well, it's interesting because I think it changes over time. Initially, I would describe it as being a promising young member of the family who can do some good things for me while I'm actually trying to pacify those provinces that the Senate has given me. And one of the first things he decides to do is, having got this title of Augustus, he decides to head out to Spain to finish the conquest, which has taken about 200 years and still hasn't come to a conclusion. And young Tiberius and his cousin, in fact, Marcellus, are appointed military tribunes. And what you find in that situation is that he, coming from a senatorial family, is now suddenly placed in the command. We don't know which legion, but he's placed in the number 2 position beneath the legionary legate, and is involved in the campaign, which, as it turns out, is ultimately successful in Spain. And at the end of that campaign, there are some rumors that Augustus is falling ill. And in fact, it's probably likely that Tiberius was with him during that time. But that was his first exposure. We're only talking a guy who's about 16 going on 17 at this point, which is quite extraordinary. When Augustus recovers sufficiently, he goes back to Rome and takes his family with him, delegates the rest of the campaign off to his deputies in Spain. And then Tiberius's political career starts at this point. And it's the traditional cursus honorum. It's the typical, you start low and you can't work your way up. But what's remarkable, at the age of 20 or so, Augustus decides that he needs to sort out the problem on the other side of the Roman Empire, which is actually on the Euphrates with its arch nemesis, the Parthian Empire. And the big surprise is he actually appoints Tiberius, his stepson, to lead that special mission, if you like, a special military operation, to coin a phrase. And what's fascinating about that whole thing is that at a moment in the summer of, I think it's 20 BC, you've got this man who's barely 20 himself, who's actually in charge of a major diplomatic and military mission, which succeeds. And at stake here is to establish a protocol with Parthia that we can maintain a non-aggression pact between the two empires. They had fought many times. So Antonius, for example, had been there in the 30s BC, funded by Cleopatra. Julius Caesar famously had thought about going to war, but died before he could actually get the campaign together. And before that, there was famous Crassus, who lost in 53 at Carrhae. So Augustus had the smarts to realize this was not a war worth fighting and he couldn't win it anyway. Let's try diplomacy. And that's where he succeeded. And the man in the center, it turns out, is young Tiberius. Now, as I wrote in my book, Marcus Agrippa, it is probably likely that the elder statesman Marcus Agrippa, who'd already been in the area coming out of the island of Lesbos with his team of deputies, probably laid some of the groundwork. And even though it was put out that there was a squabble between Augustus and Marcus Agrippa, it was probably done for the reason partly as a smokescreen so that the population wasn't quite sure what was going on. And if the thing was messed up, then there wouldn't be a loss of face because anyway, it had been disguised as something else. But the outcome of this is that Tiberius is able to bring surviving prisoners back from Parthia, from the wars before, 10, 15 years before, and the various eagle standards and the unit signa. And this is a big deal. Because what it means is Augustus is able, without himself having been there, to effectively negotiate this treaty and claim all of the kudos. And on the way back through Greece, interestingly enough, they actually meet with the poet Virgil, convince him to go back to Italy, and he really doesn't want to do that. And as it turns out, he dies, and his wishes were that his famous poem, the Aeneid, would be burned, and Augustus arranges for it not to be burned, which is how we come to have it. So on his return to Italy, not only is he clutching all of these battle standards which have been recovered from Parthia, and the great kudos that creates for him, but also this bundle of scrolls, which will have one of the world's great literary prizes. And then they reach Rome, and the outcome of that is prizes all round, altars and various thanksgivings, and Tiberius gets a promotion. So then he's accelerated through the political sphere. And so the one thing you'll find in the narrative of Tiberius, like lots of young men of his age, is this constant alternating between a political office and a military office and back and forth. And the conclusion I came from this is not only because it starts when he's 16, does this color his worldview? In other words, for example, you could paraphrase it in the sense that in order to want peace, you must prepare for war, which was the famous Vegetius expression of about 400 years later. But there's this idea that you really, really must be strong in your military posture, and diplomacy is the preferred thing to do if you can do it first. So it's almost like von Clausewitz, where you say, the point is, war is diplomacy by other means. So the default, I think, because it comes quite late in Augustus's life, is that he sees the wisdom of diplomacy over war, but he understands you must have a strong military preparedness to go with that. And all the way through, you find that Romans of the time typically will have served some time in the army. And there's a scene where one of the senators is so angry about a point being made, and he literally strips off his toga and tunic and shows the battle scars that he's got. Like, I know what war is, so don't you be arguing with me about it. And what that tells you is that people in the Senate were not casting troops at any target. They were quite thoughtful. And although the temptation was, let's get some glory and so on, the army wasn't an individual senators to play. We'd actually swore to Augustus. So everybody is ultimately playing a role of fulfilling duties at the behest and under the aegis of Augustus. And that is exactly what Tiberius does throughout all his life.
So Tiberius returns from the east. He has his eastern settlement with Parthia, but he doesn't rest on his laurels. He alternates between various commands. What is he doing on the Rhine? What is he doing in Pannonia, Dalmatia in the last few decades of the first century BC?
Well, it's interesting because now he's moving into his 20s and he's proved that he's got some talent at military affairs, probably some talent in diplomacy. And Augustus, while not yet adopting him, sees that there's further uses for him. And you've got to remember at this time that there are parts of Northern Europe which are still not really within the control of the Roman army or its people in the Imperium Romanum. And he sees in Tiberius somebody who can maybe help them out in that regard. So on the Western Balkans, there has always been trouble. Augustus himself, as a young commander, a field commander, spent years out there trying to quell and actually receive wounds. So he particularly knew how much of a problem that was. But because of its geographical position between Italy and Asia, which is, say, Turkey, Anatolia, you needed to contain that rump because you have the Via Egnatia running across the top of it. And really, it's south of that is Greece. So it's an area that you really have to try and lock down. Um, on the other side of things, the Alps region, which had been the subject of various military escapades by different commanders, was still not conquered. And even Gaul, which was supposedly conquered by Julius Caesar between 58 and 50, was itself not really pacified. So there were whole regions in the north region part of Italy and going east and west of it, which potentially were threats. So one of the things that happens, in fact, on that point is that a coalition of German tribes crosses the Rhine, causes havoc in northern Gaul, embarrasses the local commander by basically taking away all his battle standards. And by the way, this is like 3 years after Tiberius has brought the battle standards from Parthia. So now we got a new loss, which is very embarrassing personally to Augustus. He arranges to go on a military fact-finding escapade in Gaul and actually appoints Tiberius to replace the man responsible for that shaming event. His name is Lollius, Marcus Lollius. And that interestingly sets up an interesting kind of dynamic between two men who will hate each other all the way through their lives. But Tiberius is seen now as being someone who could be trusted to run a province. So he starts to run Gaul for a year or two. And then there's a decision taken that they need to deal finally with the conquest of the Alps. His young brother, who was Nero Claudius Drusus, who I wrote about in my book, Eager for Glory, who's about 3 years younger than his brother, and even less experienced. And he's also put in charge of a campaign. And he starts basically on the top of the Adriatic, round about roughly the area of Venice. And he tracks all the way through the Central Alps, quelling the tribes that have been harassing Roman trade missions up and down the mountain range. And in coordination with his brother, they do this kind of pincer movement campaign. And they succeed within a year, 15 BC, in subjecting that part of the Alps. So this is a great thing, and his brother is lauded for this. They're famously sung about in a poem by Horace. So you can read about their great Claudian brothers' achievements. And as a result of this, Augustus then switches them around. He decides that he's going to put his young brother in charge of Gaul. He's going to send Tiberius back to Italy. He'll make him consul for the year. So now he's reached the pinnacle of the Roman career path, if you like. That's it. Once you've become a consul, you've achieved it, so to speak. And then shortly after that, he's then sent to the Western Balkans, which are now still not quite sort of pacified. And there's this interesting flipping flopping, if you will, between his younger brother, who is now championed with the task of conquering the Germanic tribes. So from around about 1413, he's actually building out the forts along the Rhine, while his brother's sweating out this pacification deal in the Western Balkans. And the one who's getting all the glory is the younger brother, not so much the older one. And it's, in a sense, this is also a sort of leitmotif that describes Tiberius's life. It's other people seem to get the glory, and he's sort of left with the not quite so tough, but really hard stuff to do. But he gets a reputation of being able to do it. He doesn't complain much. He just gets on with it and achieves the end goal. So in the next 4 years, between 12 and 9 BC, his young brother is slugging it out between the Ems River and the Elbe. And in 9, he tragically dies. And there's a scene described in basically what would be the land speed record of the ancient world, where Tiberius, who's meeting with Augustus at a place called Ticinum, which is sort of in the north of Italy, they are delivered this message that your brother is badly wounded. You need to come quickly. And they race over about, I think, 3 days, covering about 200 miles per day. So they're changing horses all the way they go. And they finally get to this camp, and he takes the last few words of his brother and carries the body basically on foot with a team of centurions, and they pass it all the way down through Gaul, and they ended up by being Italy. And what you have then is two stepsons of Augustus who have proven not only their ability to do amazing things on the battlefield, but this immense brotherly love. It's a sort of Romulus Remus, maybe not quite the Castor and Pollux type relationship, which becomes again a sort of image that they wrap themselves around. And in the years following that, in order to demonstrate his devotion to his brother, he, for example, he pays for the Temple of Concordia to be rebuilt. And on the outside is the fact that the two brothers' names are conjoined there, and he builds various monuments in that spirit. So now you've got a young man who's in his 30s, who has lost his brother, and actually, I have to say, I think his best friend as well, and that damages him somewhat, I think. So there's this idea that I've been serving, and always I've been giving, right? And in the meantime, what has also happened is Marcus Agrippa has also died in 12 BC. He dies, and he leaves a widow, which is, in fact, in this particular case, Augustus's daughter, Julia, famously. And a year passes. In the meantime, Tiberius is managed, who's actually married one of the daughters of Marcus Agrippa. For the people at home, it's actually quite hard. You almost need the family tree to work out who's doing what. But Agrippa had several children of his own. He had a young daughter, Vipsania Agrippina. She was betrothed to Tiberius at a very, very young age. They got married. He was absolutely beside himself with joy at this marriage. And it's very clear that they were soulmates. There was a deep fondness for each other. And along comes Augustus in around about 11 BC and says, you need to divorce her. You need to marry the widow of Agrippa, my daughter-in-law, my daughter, Julia. And reluctantly, he does it, but Augustus has asked him to do it. He will comply. But it's very clear from his behavior that he doesn't really believe in this thing. And there's a sad scene, I believe, in Suetonius, where he talks about that he would see his former wife on a road somewhere in Rome, and he would, he'd try to talk with her and so on. And Augustus finds out about this and basically intercedes that he will never ever see that happen again, because it's embarrassing to him. Your wife is now my daughter, and that's the person you must devote yourself to. But this is another thing I think that gnaws at him. So he's lost his brother and his soulmate. And so there's a tragedy, I think, that underpins the life of what I think is a great man and underappreciated man. And the result of losing Marcus Agrippa is that now Tiberius is looked upon as the right-hand man, Mr. Fix-It. So whereas Augustus could turn to Agrippa under all sorts of circumstances to have him deal with the problem, now he looks upon Tiberius as that man. So your earlier question, I think, how should we see him? Now I see him as being something like a fixer. So he's the loyal deputy, the military commander, but he's also the guy who has to get stuff done, not all terribly pleasant. And he spends more and more time in Illyricum, which is the Western Balkans. Again, the tragedy is the fact that Julia and Tiberius try and have a child. The child dies. And at that point, the relationship between those two individuals breaks down, and he goes off and involves himself in war, leaving his wife behind in Italy at this point.
He's the new right-hand man. He's clearly psychologically, I think, traumatized by both the loss of his brother and also his wife Vipsania. His marriage with Julia is falling apart. He ends up in exile. So could you tell us, why is he in exile during this, what should be the high point of his career? What exactly are the circumstances surrounding that? And I'm using the word exile loosely. Describe it however you wish.
Yeah, they're complicated like so much. And again, we've only got the sources that we have, which primarily are going to be Suetonius, who's a bit of a gossiper. I was actually looking at Tom Holland's translation just today and enjoying the bits I read of it. And then you've got Tacitus, who has a distinct bias, it's quite clear, against Tiberius. And then finally, you've also got Cassius Dio, who's writing about 200 years or so after. And he has, again, a not terribly positive spin on the way events unfolded. But the one person who's very positive is Velleius Paterculus, who is a contemporary commander who actually served with Tiberius. And therefore, his Roman history is particularly valuable because it is genuinely witness testimony. People tend to disparage and rubbish it because it fawns, it's a bit more maybe of a panegyric. But on the other hand, it's a witness statement as far as we've got one. So we have to take it, I think, very much as it is. And when you look at all of these things, some of the facts align, some of the facts don't align at all. Some facts are reporting one but don't exist in another source. And the job I had as the historian is try and work out what sort of stuff is probably true, what stuff is made up, because unfortunately, with a lot of ancient history, as we've discussed many a time on Ancient Warfare podcasts, that picking the truth from the fake truth, the alternative facts, as it were, is part of the challenge, right? So what I had to do was align all of these things to try and make sense of it. And the conclusion I think I came to was this. By now, Tiberius, we're talking around about 11 going into 4 or 5 BC, has been fighting wars, been doing Augustus's bidding personally as well as militarily and politically. So in all the great areas of his life, he's been doing that, and he's been on the go all the time. In the same way that Marcus Agrippa had been, he'd basically been, I think, almost been worked to death. And there came a point when Agrippa had actually willingly put up for adoption 2 of his sons, Caius and Lucius. And Augustus adopted them, and the inference is that these were going to be successors in some capacity. They were going to inherit the name of Augustus come the time that Augustus would die. And some people think that in order to clear the path, as it were, to get out of the way, Tiberius decides to leave Rome. There's another idea, which is that, frankly, it was more of a physical thing, which is he was just physically worn out, and he just needed to stop and get out of the kitchen, as it were, in this instance. And maybe it's a hybrid of those two things. The sources really, really aren't terribly clear. And in fact, when I try to research it, it's quite clear that Augustus pleaded with him, please don't go. And Tiberius would make one excuse after another, and in the end, exasperated by this refusal to comply, because you're looking at the right-hand man's decided to quit, and Augustus doesn't like a quitter. He decides to finally go, and in fact, the Roman public are absolutely fascinated by the story. He tries to sneak away from Rome, but everywhere he goes, there are crowds, And eventually he ends up on Rhodes. Why Rhodes? It seems to be a place that he'd grown fond of on his way back from Parthia when he negotiated that agreement. And the impression seems to be it was really not an exile, but more of a sort of vacation break with no particular end. And in fact, he was still, at this point, by the way, he'd been given the powers of a tribune. He had tribunician power. That's not to say he had the office of, but he had the powers that gave them, which were very important and broad powers. So he could go there as a Roman citizen, as nominally a sort of family member of Augustus with this tribunician power. And all the accounts you read that he sort of quite enjoyed it. He took some of his best friends with him, and he's practicing horse riding and swordsmanship, and he's going to schools and learning about rhetoric, and he's picking holes in the teachers' arguments and so on. And there's a rather fascinating story, apparently, where he got this idea to go and visit people who weren't well. So he puts out to his adjutant, I'd like to go and visit the people in the local care center, if you don't mind. And when he gets there, he's horrified because they've been all sorted out by the gradations of their trauma, as it were. And he's expected to go and speak to them all. And you think, this isn't what I had in mind, but he's very graceful. He goes through this list. So what you get the impression is that people around him are in awe of him, right? I mean, he's a man of status, of power. And what becomes also interesting is the fact that things in Rome are changing, so that Augustus has kind of turned, he's turned the favor that he had for Tiberius, because now he's got to try and fix his own problems. He's looking to his 2 younger adopted sons, Caius and Lucius. As it turns out, Lucas dies. He's heading out to a mission in Spain, and probably dies of something like typhus or malaria, something like that. There was a lot of those sorts of things around at the time, so death was ever present and always a risk. And then Caius is heading out with one Marcus Lollius, who I mentioned earlier, out to deal with things in Armenia and that area, because there's now some problems on the border. And it would appear to be that there's potentially an opportunity maybe to tip the balance of power in the region, which is really not what the treaty they'd negotiated back in 20 BC. So now we're talking about some interesting things. And then it turns out that a lot of people are trying to ingratiate themselves with this Caius Caesar as he now is, and he's on the coins and all sorts of things. He's very much a liked and admired figure. He's a young man with lots of promise, and the Roman public adore him. And Tiberius feels that he has to go and see him, pay his respects. He goes to an island where he is, and he gets a very frosty welcome. And in fact, a lot of people choose to sail by the island of Rhodes not to meet with Tiberius. And this is a little offensive, and he's a bit hurt, I think, by that. But he remembers who didn't visit. He also remembers who visited, and that will be something again of his life in the future. So you get the impression that this is a man that probably harbors grudges. And again, I don't know that I'm not a psychologist, and I don't pretend to be. Trying to understand the psychology of this man. In some way, he is a damaged person, and in other ways, he's just ordinary because he's dealing with the things that life throws at him. And this question of whether it was exile, I think, begins to happen in the next couple of years, where he begins to realize now his tribunician power has expired, so he has no status. People are sort of suggesting, really, that maybe he should be assassinated. He should be. In fact, there's a story where apparently a bunch of people were having a drinking party in a town in Gaul, and the one said, "Well, I'm going to go out there and stab him myself." And this, I don't know how much of this is rumor, but it makes a good story anyway. And you get the impression now from reading the text that Tiberius is really anxious. He has no role anymore. And the fun of being this sort of celebrity in exile, as you've said, has really worn thin. And he starts to lobby his mother to intercede on behalf of Augustus. Can I come back, please? And Augustus goes to Caius Caesar and said, should he come back? Not sure he should. And on the second attempt, basically, now that the exposed Marcus Lollius, it turns out he's actually in the pay of the Parthians. Who could guess that? In fact, turns his mind over and says, actually, yes, maybe Tiberius can go back on the principle that he's just a private citizen, effectively a nobody. And that's what he does. He retires to Rome, and he sort of just does his books and readings and so on. He introduces his son. He has a son also called Drusus, who he introduces to the public at the age of 15, 16, and that's about it. And then what happens is Caius dies, it turns out. He sustains a wound in Armenia, and he writes from his cot somewhere in Armenia or in Syria, perhaps, where he's got fever. Father, Augustus, I would like to retire now, please. And he's only like his 20s, right? Well, Augustus is distraught because he's already lost Lucius, and now Caius is wounded, and it turns out he dies. And now Augustus has no one. So what happens is that there's this rehabilitation of Tiberius. He is allowed to actually not now just be in Rome, but to start taking on some of the former powers that he has, and he reacquires the tribunician power, and then he's given more military campaigns. What better way to show loyalty than that? Because again, I think what we're asked to believe here is that Augustus will forgive people for flaws that they have or bad decisions, as long as they prove their fidelity afterwards. And there are several examples during Augustus's time when that happens. Once again, Tiberius is sent out to that area. And what's fascinating is, in the meantime, Germany, the Germania, which is where his brother had died, has really become an unsolved problem. And so you've got two theaters of war that potentially are where there are problems that Tiberius can be involved in. One is the Western Balkans, Illyricum. And what he does then is he's considering a campaign there, but he's directed instead to solving the problem in Germania. And in fact, the big block that's thought of in that is the sort of southeastern part of what we think of as Greater Germany at that time, where the Marcomanni under Marbodus is active. Marbodus is an interesting character because he's a bit like Arminius, one of those barbarians who's thought to be highly skillful. He's very well educated. He's been educated in Rome, understands Roman military science, but can't be really trusted much. So he's allowed to go back to his people. He forms this enormous coalition. Effectively, it's like a derivative of the notorious Suebi, and he moves them into what we now think of Bohemia. Tiberius sees as part of the way to solve the problem of conquering Germania in its entirety is, in fact, to eliminate Marbodus and the Marcomanni as a potential threat. They're large in number. They have a massive force in cavalry infantry. They're very competent fighters. And they also provide a pathway between the trade between basically Northern Europe, which is Denmark with amber and the sort of valuable things like that coming down. So he's making a lot of money there. And if he's eliminated, that becomes sort of really with the purview of the Romans. And in 6 AD, he puts together one of the biggest invasion forces that Rome had seen in Carnuntum, which is near Vienna these days, and with another force basically in the Rhine, actually is going to invade the area. And sometime probably in the early summer of 86, they launched this campaign, and within days of the army being on the other side marching up the March River, it turns out that the troops they were expecting to come from Illyricum, who were infantry and cavalry, who were Illyrian troops effectively, auxiliaries from this area, have mutinied. So, in order to really complete this conquest, he's going to need all hands, and that will include auxiliaries. And it turns out they're not going to show up, and in fact, they're in rebellion. So, Tiberius has to use his wits. He agrees a hasty peace treaty with Marbodus, which basically trusts him to not cause war against Rome, and he has to turn his entire force southwards. And for the next 4 years, he and Germanicus, we mentioned him earlier, will fight this war to try and contain a rebellion, which eventually taxes everybody, it has to be said. And finally, they win this war, and they finally conquer Pannonia. So this entire period, you can see it's devoted to pacification.
Now, why would the Illyrians mutiny? What was, because you mentioned earlier that various parts of the, I'm going to air quote this, the Roman Empire were actually not pacified. They were not wholly under the control of the Romans. There are many places where various peoples were, I would say, only half pacified or chafing under Roman domination. What was it about the Illyrians that made them rise up so that they had to embark, the Romans had to embark on this truly bitter, brutal campaign of pacification?
The information in the sources that we have, I think, points to the fact of they assembled somewhere, doesn't ever disclose where, and they began to realize how many of them there were. And the conversation, oh, I didn't know there were as many as this. And oh, by the way, why are we defending the interests of Rome when in fact we could use this force to actually liberate our own peoples? And that seems very plausible. It's the sort of thing that a Roman would understand because, liberty is a central value that Romans cherish. And why wouldn't a barbarian people feel the same way? So I think that's probably the best we can do. There were lots of opportunists. I mean, what's very interesting is the fact that there are two antagonists in this fight. Really, there's the Romans and there's these Illyrian's not right. It's Illyricum rather than Illyria, but the people of that region are several tribes. Two of the biggest ones are the Pannonii, who live towards the Danube, and the Broici, who live towards the Dalmatian coast. And they both have leaders in a man called Bato. Some people think that Bato actually is like a title rather than a name, but the point is we know them as Bato of the Broici, Bato of the Pannonii. And these people come together and they rally their forces and they start picking off Roman colonies and military installations, and they're quite good at it at points, but they don't have siege equipment. So what's very interesting, there's a description in one of the earlier fights where Roman veterans who were living in a colonia, basically have to defend their own city. And of course, the inference is how are they going to, well, they must have had weapons and so forth at their disposal to be able to do that. And they are not successful. So these auxiliary troops are clearly very good at what they do, and they can overwhelm now retired Roman legionary veterans, and they spread and they cause havoc. And, it's one of those interesting wars because the Romans, in their sort of geographical understanding of the world, always feared the north. So the Gauls had been the big threat in I think the 300s or 400s, the famous story of the geese, right? So they were always worried about that part. The reason why they conquered the Alps was really, again, with this sort of idea, they needed to control that zone of influence. And then on the side, which would be the Danube going down the Western Balkans, there was always a threat to Italy. These people could pour in from there and they could cause havoc within the motherland. So there was a particular importance in their mind to actually securing the Western Balkans. As I said earlier, that Augustus himself, as a young commander in the 30s BC, had actually been out there and fought. And there's no question they were very good fighters. They could pin down legions. And what's very interesting is you study that particular campaign, both in the 30s and in the first decade of the ADs, is that they tax Roman doctrine, battle doctrine. So the Romans, instead of fighting big set piece battles, are often caught in ambushes, or they have to have these siege engagements in small hilltop towns, or they get attacked in valleys and so forth. And what they find is, in order to be able to tackle these, one big legion on its own is not the way to go. What they do is they break them into cohorts, or they put vexillations together, and they try and tackle the problem that way. And a lot of the time they are not successful. And it's hardly surprising, because the auxiliaries, of course, know how Romans fight. So they're going to find all the weak points, and they're going to actually play that to great. But finally in AD 9, the Romans secure the final victory. And there are prizes all round. There's a triumph given to Tiberius and other sort of honors for Germanicus and his team. And then news of Teutoburg arrives.
I was going to ask, any other problems on the frontiers after the revolt was put down, and you beat me to it. So it's AD 9, and spoiler alert, everybody. Augustus does not take it well, and he only has a few more years to go. So why don't you tell us, what was the disaster in the Teutoburg forest? How did it affect Augustus, and how did everything end up with Tiberius in power?
Well, gosh, so really it's just a few years and a very long story. And I'm going to suggest to people they might want to read my Augustus at War, because I try and explain all of this in short form, and I'll try and summarize it here. So the way that the Roman command structure works is that there's typically a commander in charge of a task force, expeditio. And there would have been one in the Balkan War, the War of the Bartos, and that man was Tiberius. So as Augustus' chief deputy, he could have gone and made his own decisions, but he decided, in fact, to go to Italy to find out what needed to be done by talking with Augustus. Remember, he comes from a background, really, where diplomacy is better than a fight. And they've just spent 4 years fighting one holy conflagration, which has taken something like half of the Roman army to defeat it. When you look at the numbers, it's quite extraordinary. So what he does, in fact, he now delegates Germanicus, who's actually he's going to be his adopted son during his, I think it's about 4 AD. So he's had to prove himself too, and he's proved, as it turns out, to be a very adept field commander in his own right. Tiberius sends him off to the Rhine forts and says, you better form a defensive line, because we're expecting the Germans to come down. You have to imagine, and the reason I'm telling the story this way is to sort of try and convey some of that they're dealing with absence of knowledge, right? So messages are coming down on horses, right, with a letter. This is the latest brief. You read the brief and go, oh, it turns out that 3 Roman legions have been attacked in a forest in Germany somewhere. Okay. And another one comes and says, the commander, Varus, has taken his own life or been slaughtered. And they're like, what? In the meantime, the field commanders on the Rhine themselves are getting people, effectively, the people who are the survivors, coming down. And there's a bridge that crosses the Rhine. And there's quite a dramatic image of this only one crossing point. And the Roman commanders are basically saying, we need to cut the bridge, because they're imagining a horde coming down. Well, that horde never comes, but they don't know this yet. So that these people have been able to rally in a couple of forts, famously Aliso, on one of the tributaries of the Rhine up there. And there are survivors, and some of them come down. And famously, Augustus' own granddaughter at this point is standing on the bridge, insisting to the commander, you will not burn this bridge. I'm the granddaughter of Augustus, and I'm telling you to keep the bridge standing. Because more and more Roman troops, wounded or basically distressed, are coming in. As a sort of footnote, it's important to realize that at this point, the Romans are looking at the lands across from the Rhine, and to some extent the Rhine across from the Danube, as coming under Roman control, and they're being pacified. So they look at this as being where they have to move Germanic tribes into townships. Waldgerimus is an interesting example of how that might be. Roman troops are deployed widely across the territory in little kind of groups and road stations. And what's been fascinating with German archaeology in recent years is that more clues as to where Romans might have been are coming forward. So I mentioned Waldgerimus, but there are forts that are being identified now, supply dumps, and something, which shows that the Romans were widely dispersed. And what the German coalition under Arminius cleverly did, and again, he, like Marbodus and the two Bartos, understood the Roman military doctrine, were able to use that against the Romans. So they were able to pick off all of these and actually overwhelm them, and then finally to attack Varus and his column as he's marching through. So it's a betrayal of trust on the one hand, it's liberation on the other. And Tiberius is in this situation because he is now the most senior commander below Augustus, who no longer takes to the field. The last time he took to the field was in that war in Spain back in the 20s. And at that point, he realizes, I'm too old for this game. I'm going to let my deputies take this on. And Tiberius is that man that leads this group at this point. So in 89, there is this overwhelming massacre. There are survivors. We learn about that. But in the Roman mindset, it goes back to sort of like the Gauls, what terrors could this represent? And they imagine that the German horde is going to come rushing down and then invade Italy. And what Tiberius ends up by doing is raising a conscript army of Roman citizens and what few remaining freedmen there still are. And if they weren't freedmen, they would just take slaves, freed them, and put them in the army. And there are cohorts, and he marches them basically up to Germany to deal with this. And the intention is really to decide what they want to do with that region. That the instinct of some people would have been launch a punitive raid immediately and to go off and try and retake what was there. And there are still some tribes in that region which are allies of Rome, and they're quite loyal. And they, in a sense, have to be supported too, because that's what allies are supposed to do for other allies. Well, Tiberius actually waits a year. He takes a small force in 10, maybe 11 AD. And what they do is they effectively prove to the Germans, we can come and go as we like. In September, they have games in honor of Augustus's birthday, and they pack up the tents and they march back over the Rhine. And it's an odd idea, but they're effectively, in Tiberius's way of thinking, Rome has to decide what it's going to do. It has to reconsolidate its policy and its manpower, because 3 legions is a lot of men. And it turns out that Rome never reconstitutes those 3 legions, and therefore there's a drawdown of troops from places like the Iberian Peninsula, and they're moved to the Rhine. So there's a shifting around of troops in that area, and they have to really decide, is their posture now going to be aggressive or defensive? And I think Tiberius's inclination and advice to Augustus is, look, we tried the expansion card for something like 30 years, and this is where it's got us. Yes, we now have Illyricum is peaceful. We have all of the Alps. We've kind of sorted out the Gallic problem. We've got a good frontier going with the east, and the Iberian Peninsula is sorted out. And quite frankly, there's not much problem in Africa. So that's it. Just keep what you got. And the so-called last advice that Augustus gives Tiberius, we're told, there's a thing called a breviarum, which is like a summary of military assets and where all the units are, is that you will keep the rivers and the mountains as our frontiers. And it makes perfect sense because they tried everything else. And they spent a lot of money and they lost a lot of lives in the process of trying to do different things. And what in a way, the way I describe it in my book is that whereas Virgil, the man who had died, the writer of the Aeneid, has that famous line of Jupiter telling Aeneas that Rome's destiny is imperium sine fine, which is to say power or empire without end. Well, his is to replace the sine with cum, which is to say empire with limits. And all his training, in a sense, would appeal to that. I mean, he's a man who's been fighting wars of pacification rather than wars of conquest, except in one regard. And so my little digression here will be what happens with Augustus. So finally, having got some sort of modicum of peace upon the northern frontier, Tiberius is back in Italy working with Augustus. And it's very clear that Augustus is old and frail. He's, quite an aged man in his 70s by this time. And he can't really see well. He doesn't speak very loudly. His proclamations and things have to be read in the Senate by his son-in-law, and Tiberius is part of that. And Tiberius has now become effectively the front man of the Roman government. So when they get deputations from foreign countries, including places like India, for example, it is to Tiberius these people go, because he's the man who's able to stand there, understand diplomacy, understand war, and speak for Augustus. I mean, this is where he is. And he's also accumulated all of the various powers. There is no role of emperor in the Roman way of looking at government. They come up with the title of princeps, which effectively is first man. It's not an elected office; it's sort of honorific. Augustus is an honorific, but what he also has, Augustus, is a whole bunch of different things. There's tribunician power. He's been consul multiple times, but above everything else, he has this what we now call authority, which comes from the Latin auctoritas, but it really means influence. So when he speaks, people listen because they say, well, you are in fact the son of the divine Julius, so you kind of got like a god in your history. You've been around a very, very long time. You know everybody who there is. You've picked pretty much everybody that does anything in the city. So we take note. And Tiberius is sort of really in the shadow of this for the previous 10, 15 years. So when Augustus finally dies, and this is all the way down in Campania, and oh, by the way, Tiberius had been given another mission to go back to Illyricum and sort out some issues that were still unfinished out there. So he gets to the port over on the other side of the Adriatic. The messenger does, you got to come back. He comes all the way back. Here's the last messages of Augustus, so we're told. And this is where it's interesting because lots of people infer that Augustus would have basically said to Tiberius something along the lines, these are the things you need to do. It's all in the will, get on with it. It's not clear that that's the case because, in a sense, Rome is not a monarchy. So Augustus can't pass any powers over to Tiberius. And in fact, all the evidence that I was able to gather seemed to suggest that when Augustus finally dies and the announcement is made, it may have been delayed a couple of days, but what Tiberius does effectively is to issue missives, letters out to the various field commanders along the frontiers and say, this is how things are. Emperor's dead. We're going to have to sort out what we do. He doesn't instantly say, I'm the princeps. Quite the contrary. What seems to be is that they arrange the funeral. They have the funeral in Rome. There's a big debate in the Senate. And at that point, the Senate says, we need you to take over. And in the various descriptions, remember I was talking about how the Tacitus and Cassius Dio and Velleius Paterculus and Suetonius, they have slightly different accounts of these various discussions. Boiling it down, it seems to be that he was very annoyed. He said, we have to deal with the funeral first, and then we'll talk business. And over the next several days, the discussion takes place between the Senate. There are parties in there saying, we'd like you to be first man. And he responds basically, this job is too big for one man. We need a committee. We need a bunch of guys to come and be in charge. And this rather odd discussion happens. Okay, so which job would you like then? And he gets very annoyed because he said, well, you can't ask the guy that's divvying it up which job he wants. That's not how it works. And it goes on and begins to escalate, and there's some personal remarks exchanged, if you believe the sources. And finally, it gets to breaking point where, okay, well, if you're not going to take the job, well, we'll go find someone else. We've got a couple of candidates over here. And my read of it is that people describe Tiberius as reluctant. I don't think he was reluctant. I think he was the only man in the room that actually understood what the job meant, because he'd worked side by side with Augustus for so long. He may not have wanted the job, but I think he was smart enough to know there were other people you couldn't trust to get the work done, because it was a balancing act. It was on the one hand, it was military, but it was political for sure. And I think the other part of it is that he probably genuinely wanted, in the way that his ancestry was, this is why I have to tell the story of his ancestry, his family were Claudians. So they were fiercely people who were of independence, are proud of being Roman, and also Republican with a small r, right? They believed in the structures, the institutions of the res publica, the Roman Commonwealth. And effectively, what Augustus had done is kind of shaken it around and put a new man on top under the pretense that all those other pieces were still there, but people sort of kowtowed to him. So it wasn't a monarchy and it wasn't really an autocracy because there still was a Senate and there were still voting assemblies and so forth. But in practice, what Augustus wanted kind of got done. And I think there's a case can be made that Tiberius was keen to try and restore some of the balance of the previous style. But here's the kicker. He didn't know what that was. Because don't forget, he'd been born. We started right at the conversation right at the start where he was born in a civil war. The last man really to kind of do that stuff was Julius Caesar. He'd been dead. Tiberius never knew him. Everything he knew was in the books. A lot of those have been destroyed, by the way, because Augustus controlled the narrative of who Julius Caesar was, and all the books of comedies and famous speeches, they were all destroyed on purpose. And then before that, you've got the triumvirate with people actually tinkering with the working of the Senate. And effectively, there's not many people around at the time of Tiberius who know what that old republic works like. So they've had to sort of study the history books, listen to their elders, if they're still around, and say, how was it in the old days? So Tiberius is coming at this with in a sense, a hand-me-down recollection of what the Roman Republic was supposed to work like, with a group of senators who probably don't know what it works like either, and they're all trying to muddle along forward in this fashion. And finally, then, Tiberius accepts that he will be the princeps and he will attend to all of this. But the style of his working is very clearly, I expect the Senate to do hard work. And it's very clear from the Senate's point of view that they don't seem to want to do the hard work.
They settle on Tiberius. It's been roughly 60 years or more since the fall of the Republic. Tiberius is now doing the math, roughly 50 years old. So he's not a young man.
He's 55.
Right. And he takes power AD 14. And how did his government, because he's going to reign until AD 37, how does his government, what is it, how is it similar to that of Augustus? How does it differ? Because he is reigning through some difficult times as well. How do things go for him?
Well, this is where again you need to understand where the historians come from, and in one of the chapters of my book, I somewhat exhaustively try and tear apart what it was that Tacitus, for example, and Cassius Dio were trying to do. So when you understand what those writers were the story they were trying to tell, the narrative position, the editorial position they adopted, the way that it sort of divides up is that Tacitus sees there are stages in Tiberius's rule, and it starts off good, and then it starts to fall apart, and he becomes a despot. And the way I look at things, I think that is really to taint the evidence. You can certainly give that gloss if you hold certain things back, but I think the truth of the matter is that he came from this point of view that I expect you as senators and grown men and men of honor, many of whom have actually served in the army and actually with him, to do their job. So he will preside when he's consul over sessions of the Senate, and when he's not, he expects the people to carry on. And the job of the Senate is to provide basically directives. They issue edicts on things, and there's a voting assembly of the people who enact on the law and so on. So there's this body of law that the Roman people have to consider and discuss. And it's very clear when you look at, and I actually have a table of this in my book, where it's interesting to look at the types of laws and areas of law that really were of interest to Tiberius. And they come down to things like good behavior, right? So good moral behavior, so acting properly in public mostly. So, for example, it may well be that if you're a government official, there's a code of conduct implied, but there are rules you're supposed to follow, and there'll be consequences if you don't. There are rules on the way you collect evidence, for example, from slaves, when in fact there's been a problem in a household. The traditional thing is that they get tortured before their testimony is accepted. He doesn't allow, for example, women to become gladiators. He thinks that's below and demeaning to women. that there are provisions for the army and so forth. So there are certain areas where it's very clear that he has a very traditional, sort of backward-looking view of what Roman society is, and that through his legislation and through the various things that we learn about, he gets very upset about things like some of the Roman families have become so fabulously wealthy that they're wearing Chinese silks, right? They're able to import silks from China through I guess the Silk Road that's bringing this stuff through Iran. And he doesn't like it. He thinks that's below the dignity of a Roman man to do that. So please don't be wearing silks. It's demeaning. People lavishly host feasts and so on and so forth. And he sets an example. You don't need a whole pig to feed you just need a half a pig, and we'll eat the other half tomorrow. So you get the sense of someone who is a little old-fashioned, a traditionalist in outlook, who holds high standards for himself and expects others to follow. He's obviously very practical. So there's a scene where apparently he's I think, at a public engagement, it's a theatre performance or something, and the heavens open. It begins to rain, and he's wearing a toga like you're supposed to. And he takes off his toga, calls for one of his adjutants, who provides him a cloak. Well, he's a military guy. It's raining. I'm going to put on something sensible. And it's this is what I like about the man. I think that you've got someone who's probably hard as nails, can be quite jovial, but actually sort of a little bit maybe skeptical and even cynical in some areas, who harbors some resentments about people for things that have happened to him in his past. But I think he's a man of principle. And then as time goes on, he begins to realize that, the Senate really isn't really up to the job it's expected to do. And I think there's a certain element of maybe disillusionment, perhaps, that begins to creep in. You begin to see the rise of the so-called delatores, who are these informers, who are looking at any chance to bring people to court in order to win a verdict, and that way they get paid by taking some of the loot from their estate. Tiberius was not responsible for doing that. Augustus had actually taken a body of what was called majestas. Majestas literally means majesty. And the idea was that you could act in such a way that was undignified before the majesty of the Roman people. We consider that to be treason now, but it means any bad behavior technically could really fit within that very broad statement, where we tend to think of treason as being something like, killing a leading government official or a king or something like that, or betraying secrets. Well, Romans certainly believed that, but it was a lot bigger tent that could encompass a lot of things. And where Tiberius is unfortunate is that his historians decided to really list every single one of these treason trials, creating the impression that Tiberius is that man who gets off on treason trials. And what's very evident, if you look at the actual numbers of, a lot of them were dismissed. A lot of the people who were actually charged were actually forgiven and or sent into exile. Exile is a very clever way of, you don't execute a Roman as you exile them. That way they can maintain their dignity and their name as far as it goes, but their property is effectively confiscated and so on and so forth. So what you see is a man at work who is dealing with the daily grind of government. In fact, what's extraordinary when I was going through this, and I was literally writing from Tacitus and other sources, the cases, and even I was beginning to think, God, this is hard work. Just describing these cases, what he had a reputation for was being a wise and just man. It's very interesting. We get those names from people like Strabo, for example, the geographer, and people like Seneca and Josephus in their descriptions of him. And Pliny the Elder, they create a much more nuanced personality. And I think what comes out of this is that someone who is doing all of this work, feeling that the side is letting him down, and that I was just writing about this yesterday, that there was a feeling that going into the army was below certain people in the Senate, and it creates a manpower crisis, quite frankly. So Tiberius is appealing to people, say, why am I having to spend my time persuading good men to become officers in the Roman army? Isn't that something that everybody wants to do? He has to deal with a mutiny. You mentioned the mutiny earlier, and one of the interesting things about that was a pivotal moment where not only was it a problem because it was a mutiny, and you had the Rhine and Danube legions who could basically have turned against him and actually marched and caused untold havoc that we saw in AD 69. It'll take another few years before that shows itself. But his sons go out, Germanicus and his son Drusus go out and deal with that. And it turns out it's actually a terms and conditions struggle. The men aren't happy with their pay. They don't like the extended conditions. And they negotiate a deal to actually reduce the years of service, slightly increase their pay. And Tiberius is very pleased that his sons basically backed him. But a year later, he does the calculus and says, we can't afford that. And in fact, he then winds back the terms of service to the original terms, allowing a little bit extra pay for the servicemen. So he's obviously a man who's got control of the numbers, and he's a military guy, understanding that how are we going to have an army of 25 legions if we're going to have to kind of have these years of service? Because every year that you retire someone early is going to cost, right? So you see all of these facets of his personality coming into play here. And I think for somebody who's now getting into his 60s, who had probably hoped that he could start thinking about retiring, like moving backwards. Remember, he went on that jaunt to Rhodes. He thought that maybe he could get out of this. He'd even made the statement to the Senate saying, if at any time you want me to leave, I will be happy to go. The Senate never did. They never asked him.
Tiberius spends his last years on Capri, the island of Capri, off the coast of southern Italy, and he leaves Sejanus in charge. And from what I understand, everything goes swimmingly in Rome with Sejanus there. Enlighten me. What does Sejanus get up to?
Well, so there's another guy, right, that has had a bad press. And of course, everybody who's ever watched I, Claudius will always remember Patrick Stewart in that role. I don't think anybody ever could play that role again. He is always Lucus Aelius Sejanus.
I see Patrick Stewart's face every time I read about Sejanus, no matter where, no matter what.
And yet the irony is I don't think there's any representations. Maybe there's one or two coins from, I think, one of the Spanish provinces. It's a side profile and rather crude, because guess what? All the statues were smashed up and broken purposefully. So what can you say? Well, in AD 14, there are a couple of prefects in charge of what is the Praetorian cohorts of the time. And there are, I think, a father-son team, Lucius Aelius Seius and Sejanus. And over the next several years, there is a combination of those roles. So there's now only one praefectus praetorio, which becomes Aelius Sejanus. I'll use the English pronunciation. And there's a moment where, in the time of the Danube Legion mutiny, his son Drusus is sent up there, and this prefect in charge of the Praetorian cohorts, about two cohorts go all the way. So you have to imagine that whenever the emperor leaves Italy, he's going with this group of cohorts who are basically his military bodyguard, but it also extends to his family. So there's a connection at this point, not only because of the seniority of his office, of his military guard, but also the fact he's actually defended and protected a family member, which is his son. So against that context, you've got someone who is a military guy. He's an equestrian. That's to say he's not a senator. So he's sort of barred from those senatorial type positions. And what that does is that puts a cap on his aspirations for political advancement. And there's a suggestion that maybe that didn't run too well with him. He thought himself much more able than that, and maybe he had aspirations to higher things. The consulship, maybe more. It's not entirely clear. So Sejanus is about 20 years younger than Tiberius, but they have a similar sort of experience. They've grown up in military circles, and Sejanus has proven himself trustworthy. It's then demonstrated to him personally when Tiberius is visiting his holiday villa in a place called Spelunca, which is famous. It's right on the coast of Campania, and there's a grotto, there's a cave, and right outside this grotto they built a villa with a dining room. So it was filled with statues, and it was very evocative. It was Neptune and Augustus and all this sort of mythical stuff. And on the one evening that they're visiting, there's a terrible noise breaks, and rocks from this cave come tumbling down, and some people are killed under the weight of these rocks, and they sort of pull away the rocks to find Tiberius and Sejanus is kind of over him like this, and it's like, oh my God, he saved the emperor. And you can imagine, well, gosh, I mean, he put his life on the line for me. I mean, he's got to be a man I can trust with my affairs. And from that point, you see a much tighter relationship between those two. to the point where Tiberius allegedly calls him socius laborum. He is my associate in work. Partner in my labors is the way that some people describe it. And I think what Tiberius feels is that, well, he'd like to be able to withdraw a little bit from the drudge. And I think that really is a good word to describe, because it felt like drudge to me when I was writing about it. All these cases in the Senate and all the sort of detail work. Are the prices of bread and lentils is too high? What are we going to do about it, Caesar? This person committed a murder and threw the wife out the window. What are we going to do about it? Minutiae go. And he has a chance in this man to maybe take some of the weight of this whole machinery of government off him. And this may be the opening that Sejanus is maybe looking for. And he begins to see, well, maybe I should ask for one of his family members' hand in marriage. Maybe he's actually married to a lady called Apicata and has children by her, but he has aspirations and assignations, I guess, with I think one of Germanicus' daughters. And the net result of all of this is that Livilla, the young daughter, starts to sleep with him. He breaks away from his wife, basically asks to marry and this Livilla is married to Drusus, his son. So that's not a possibility. Tiberius says, well, actually, you're an equestrian, so you're not really the same class, and that's never going to work. But I think you're a great guy. When an opportunity comes up, I'll keep you in mind. So, keep up the good work. Well, it turns out that Sejanus seems to have a way to maybe accelerate things by actually causing the death of Drusus. And the way it's sort of presented is that, well, he died maybe sort of through sickness, and it was all natural causes. There's nothing to worry about, and Tiberius just gets on with his work and is looked upon as being a role model because he's a grieving father. But look, he's still leading the state, not being fully aware of all the facts. And then Sejanus, having been rebuffed, anyway decides to shack out with Livilla, and they sort of cavort together. And he begins to encourage Tiberius to leave Rome on a pretty permanent basis. And they spend more time in this place, Spelunca, ultimately deciding to go to Capri. And one of the things that was interesting to me, again, insight into maybe Tiberius's personality, is that rich Romans spent time in Campania. So Julius Caesar and Marius and all the famous generals had villas in various places. For example, there would be Oplontis is a famous one. There'd be Baiae, which is like a famous playground area, which had notorious parties, and the areas around Pompeii. Well, the kind of individual that we see Tiberius becoming is a man who revalues his privacy. And the last place he wanted to be was a spectacle in one of those towns. So he decides to retire, I use the word carefully here, to physically relocate himself to the island of Capri, which is this rocky block in the Bay of Naples. And it's quite hard to get to. There are only one or two landing points on the island. But Augustus had actually already built villas there. So there were rooms available. And it seems to be, actually, they found that some of the first recorded ancient dinosaur bones there, they understood that these were very ancient giants or something. So the appeal of the place, its associations with mythology and legend really appeal to Tiberius at this point. And he decides that that's where he'd like to spend a lot of time. And there are supposedly like 12 villas. The most famous is the Villa Jovis or Villa Ionis, depending on how you read the texts. And this is an amazing, what I described when I looked at the floor plan, I said, this is almost like a military praetorium. This is almost like you could expect to see in a Roman military camp where the legate will live, right? It's square and it's got suites of rooms, it's got a bathhouse, it's got toilets and rooms for slaves and adjutants and so on. And what's interesting about this one, it's right on the tip of a hill, which is now called Monte Tiberio, interesting enough. And in the center of it were 4 huge big cisterns. So the idea would be that they'd collect rainwater in hundreds of gallons, which would then service through pumps this place. And this is where Tiberius decides to live with his books and with his gardens, because it turns out he likes growing a lot of vegetables and that sort of thing. So he decides to live there.
Interesting. So Sejanus falls afoul of Tiberius. How does he fall afoul? What makes Tiberius move against him? What does Sejanus do?
It seems to be that he was getting information. Don't forget, what's happening now is that Tiberius, having decided to sort of work Work from home. He's working from home on Capri. Okay. So that's a better, not exiled, working from home. I think that's the better way to, because he's still engaged in government. But what he's trying to do, and this is my interpretation in the book, is that he's saying to the Senate, look, I'm giving you the freedom to run the operation now, right? It's all yours. And, I will write letters to you and you can ask my advice on things. And they do. And these letters go through Sejanus. They go through the fleet at Misenum. They are delivered. And there's a little contingent of the Praetorian cohorts on the island, which is his bodyguard. So there's a controlled flow. And he writes letters back. He's got a group of friends with him. People tend to think he lives alone. He doesn't. He actually has a group of 4 or 5 really close friends who've been with him all through his life. He actually was quite social in that way. But he tended to have long, deep relationships rather than superficial ones with lots of people. And he loved writing and researching. He liked to grow a certain kind of cucumber, interesting enough, and some other fascinating things. He was big into astrology. That's a whole different discussion. And where Sejanus, in a sense, had sort of begun to maybe let things go awry for himself, was that his interests and aspirations for power had become more prominent and obvious. And Tiberius at some point gets wind of there being a plot. He sets up a very, very elaborate trap. And again, I think this is the military mind going. He bides his time. He plans everything to the smallest detail, even to having a plan B, which is to actually take one of his grandsons to be a rebel leader if anything happens to him, to actually save the Roman Republic. And long and the short of it is, he sets up this trap involving replacing him as the Praetorian prefect with another guy, and involving the urban cohorts of Rome in this subterfuge. And he is denounced in the Senate by reading of a letter, which is beautifully played in I, Claudius, by the way, if anybody wants to go and listen to that. He starts this letter with the sort of, this man has been my friend and he's done all these great things. However, and this list of complaints starts, and then people begin to realize, sorry, was that a criticism? Oh, God, it was. And they start deserting him. Anyway, he is summarily arrested. And what's very interesting is the way that the Senate now takes command of his fate. It's not Tiberius. Ultimately, he is denounced by Tiberius as a threat, but the Senate basically condemns him to death, throws him in jail, and he's badly abused there, and ultimately he's executed and his body is thrown in the Tiber. Tiberius had nothing to do with it. It's very interesting because people seem to think of him being a monster and a tyrant, but actually the Senate is acting in that mode, not Tiberius. And in fact, when a deputation comes to Capri to sort of say, look, we've dealt with, he refuses to see them.
So Tiberius finally, long last, he passes in 37. He's succeeded by Gaius, who is better known to history as Caligula. That itself could be the subject of its own podcast episode. But to wrap things up, where do you see Tiberius in history? That is, what did he do for Rome of real consequence? Because now we're fully into what historiographers call the Roman Empire, even if the Romans themselves were not, calling it the empire just yet. What did Tiberius do that we should remember?
I think the important thing is that where Augustus had been very much a reconstitutor, if that's a word, that he'd taken a republic that was basically in civil war. He had got it in a working shape, and he'd extended the Roman Empire, but it took a different kind of personality and a different policy to be able to ensure that would survive. You've got to remember that it's very significant within the first months or so of Augustus dying, as there's a mutiny on the Rhine and the Danube. The army is not happy, and the army is the thing that keeps the emperor in power, as you will see for the next 300 years in Roman history. So I think the first thing is that it takes a Roman military commander to understand that and understand the complexity of that, to be able to work. And he takes very proudly and conscientiously the job of commander-in-chief. And in fact, when the Senate sort of meddles, he basically tells them to keep out of it. But he also expects them, when he asks for things, that they will provide it. The way I look at the historical Tiberius is someone that really he secured the Roman Empire on the basis of what I've just said, but he was then slandered by history. The things that we tend to know or remember about him, I think it's important, again, referring back to Suetonius, is the gossip of his last days, of some of the terribly outrageous sexual things he was supposed to have done, and all of these treason trials. And I think what's interesting is that you have to understand that that slander comes out of a Roman way of rhetoric and presenting cases in court. That there are several people that have written about him, talk about there maybe being, between Tacitus and Cassius, another historian who wrote a biography, and it's conjectural, I know. But the point is they share a lot of the same facts, and amongst those facts is gossip. And what's very interesting, if you look at the people who were his contemporaries, people like Strabo and Velleius Patercus, and even some of the ones in just a few decades of that time, like Josephus and Seneca, they might acknowledge that he might have had a cruel side to his nature. I'm sure a lot of people could be, when they're given lots of power in the age of their 70s, can probably, when they've been used to being the autocrat, they can probably use that in bad ways. But I think what they do, there's the word vituperation, which is effectively character assassination. And he has been, particularly through the hands of Tacitus, very badly attacked. And it tends to be the attacks that have stood the test of time. One of the fascinating things I found in researching this, the historians who were actually very pro Tiberius were surprisingly the early Christian historians. So you're talking Tertullian, Eusebius, and these sorts of people. And the reason why they like Tiberius is that they spell out the reasons. And one of them, which is, it was under Tiberius that Christians began. And he didn't stand in their way. In fact, there's a story, I think it's apocryphal, and nobody else generally reports this, but the story goes that that the Christians basically approached Tiberius and said, would you please consider our Christ as a god? And they found a sympathetic ear in Tiberius. And the story goes that the Senate said, that's not your remit. That's what we decide. Keep your hands off this. And he basically does on the premise that they will not attack or harm Christians. And there are various tellings of this in the Christian stories. Now, I know that the Christians had an axe to grind, which is they're trying to present themselves as positive in the eyes of pagan Romans. But it's very interesting to me that sort of story that goes, you were talking about historiography, that's one of the threads that goes off, that the Romans themselves just built on this sort of legend, which I think is slanderous. That's why I think he's probably the most slandered of emperors, and undeservedly. He, as it turns out to have been, and if you go back to what Tacitus says, for those first 55 years of him being alive, he was a loyal and dutiful servant of Augustus, and in fact a proud soldier and general. And then for the next 10 or so years, he was actually a very good emperor in the sense of fair and all the rest. Things go wrong in the perception when he decides to leave to go to Capri. And that's where opportunities for gossip and all sorts of weird and wonderful stories, the sort of things that tourist guides would tell you if you visited Capri. But I think what that created was a vacuum. And he has not been best served by historians in the years go by. So part of the challenge for me was to answer the question, was he really, really like that? And I came to the conclusion, no, he wasn't.
Lindsay, you've written a fascinating and wonderful book. When can our listeners pick up copies?
I'm in the process of doing the index right now. My commissioning editor is probably wondering where it is. It's very hard to do indexes. May, June of 2025.
Oh, okay. Fantastic. Looking forward to it. All right. So thank you very much. Once again, Tiberius, from Masterly Commander to Masterful Emperor of Rome. It's published by Pen and Sword. Look for it over the summer. Take care.